Thank you, Doctor. Let's begin with common ground. One, America is not going to default. We're going to raise its debt limit on time. The question is, can we come together to find a way to deal with government finances that are out of whack today, become more exacerbated over time, and fiscally, just financially, are unsustainable, and also weigh, I think, on investors' view of the country today. Secondly, I think we can agree sequester was not built to last for a number of reasons, and it also ignores a large swath of the government spending as well. And I think there's agreement there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a better way than what we're doing today. So looking at the rules that I was amazed at the chart to see the number of countries that have some of those different type of rules in place. For us, as we look at issues from balanced budget, which clearly a number of us support, to spending rules, sequester would be an example of it. Looking at debt to GDP, Dr. Hassett, your point is that the best measurement of government, or the one we should focus on, is the size of the government relative to the size of the economy. Can you tell us why?
Sure. It's actually, there are many reasons. It goes back to work that I did more than a decade ago when I started to look at political opinions about the deficit, and found that it's very often the party in opposition that cares the most about the deficit and becomes the deficit hawk party, because it's, maybe it's hard to say, I don't want that tax cut, or I don't want that program to help children, or whatever it is that one party might be proposing, but it's easy to say, oh, the deficit's going to be really terrible. And so I think that really in the end, my conclusion after studying a lot of American political history is that both parties in equilibrium have the same attitude towards the deficit, which is that they don't like reducing it. That if you give people a free lunch, then they're happier voters, and that they don't want it to be so big that it becomes a real problem, and that there's a space between, say, 2% of GDP and 6% of GDP where we've kind of wandered. And so I think that what parties disagree about is the size and the scope of government. And that if we're having a debate about something other than that, then we're not actually debating the true issue, is my view. That's the first reason why. The second thing is that I think that if we spend money, then we have to pay for it. And if you pay for it by paying all of it today, or by paying, or borrowing from somebody and then paying, 5 cents a year forever, that in present value it's the same. And so I think that in the end, it's the spending that is the material thing that we need to address. And I would encourage Congress to think of this problem as not as setting a goal for spending, which is a very controversial thing, but setting a cap. So look, if spending gets above this percent of GDP, then we have to go back to the old world where we have to increase the debt limit and have showdowns like this, a world that we don't like to be in. If we're below that cap, then we function normally as a government. I think that if you could get to that debate, then you could start something that could be very positive in the long run, and might, as if we continue to avoid our problems on entitlements, then we might start to run into that cap, and then really have to have an entitlement reform down the road. And so I think the very first order of business should be to say, let's get out of this world where we have to every year push these things forward, like the continuing resolutions and the debt limits, and let's just agree that we'll continue along the lines of your MAP bill if we're below the cap. And so I think that the argument for that is pretty sound and convincing to me, but maybe not to Mr. Zandi.
Well, thank you, Doctor. Dr. Zandi, as we look at the size of government, the debt, the spending rules, all that we've just discussed, should we be looking at the bigger picture, not just discretionary, but the entitlement spending as well? Is looking at that as a share of the economy the right goal? We may disagree on what the size of that government is. You have to fill in those blanks from both parties, but is that a measurement? Is that a goal that would direct Congress toward looking at the right areas, how you grow the economy, and how you deal with all of spending, not just a portion of it? Or is there a better way?
Right. Well, as I said, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we should have budget rules, more comprehensive budget rules that consider, as you said, all of government spending and also tax revenue and other revenue.
Yeah.
I think that's important. Particularly if we can use these new budget rules as a way to reduce the brinkmanship we have around the current process, the debt limit being the most notable example. I find this is obviously becoming very counterproductive. So we need to figure a way to mitigate the threat posed by the debt limit. And I think the budget rules, using budget rules to do that is a logical approach and could reap some benefit in terms of better fiscal outcomes in the longer run. So I'm very sympathetic with that idea. I'm less sympathetic to the idea that we should have only spending caps. And I'll give you three reasons for that. And then I'll give you a suggestion as to how I would approach it. One is that it doesn't account for, or it may, but it's difficult to see how it would account for changing demographics that are going to be quite significant. I'll just give you a number. Today, 13% of the population is over the age of 65, and if you're over the age of 65, you require a higher level of services than people that are of other ages. Over the next 25 years, that's going to rise to 21 to 22% of the population, according to the Bureau of Census. So that demographic fact is very important and significant and would affect how you would think about the size of government in terms of spending as a share of GDP. So that's something that needs to be considered in this context. The other thing I worry about is that the economy goes up and down and all around, as we know. We need to have some flexibility, both in terms of the automatic stabilizers in the budget and discretionary response to recessions. There's a lot of debate about discretionary fiscal stimulus, and I understand that. It's a legitimate, very appropriate debate. But I do think it's important that we maintain flexibility. And, you know, the spending rule with those kinds of caps, unless somehow it can be adjusted to account for this fact, would make me nervous, would make me uncomfortable.
Well, I think Dr. Axe's point about using potential GDP rather than GDP smooths those out, so you don't have government spending, you know, great in the boom times and then, you know, unsustainable cuts in the rough times when you actually need some of that spending to occur. I think your point was, look, let's sort of put the guardrails, you know, in there that provide that flexibility.
And I think that Mr. Zandi, Dr. Zandi would probably agree with this. If you look at countries that save for the rainy day, Sweden is an example, that their view is that maybe you want to have a stimulus if a recession strikes, and that's why you need to be, say, below the cap before. And that's why I said that what we ought to do is start by having a cap, not a target. Because then we have to stay below the cap enough so that if a recession hits, then we can do something. And the demographic point I could respond to as well is just that would affect your target. That as you think about it, so for example, some people say spending shouldn't be higher percentage of GDP than it's been historically, but that's kind of unreasonable if you look at the aging of the population. Yeah. It's driving the increase in spending.
Let me, as I turn it over to the Vice Chairman. I noticed in the 20 years from 81 to 2000, you know, GDP, size of the government went from 22% GDP to 18%. Population was still growing, entitlements were still continuing to expand. But during that period, as we lowered the size of government relative to the economy, you know, jobs along Main Street exploded, 37 million jobs, about a 50% increase. Clearly, we do have some demographic factors there, but there is a role there where we, I think, could have a good discussion about what size we want this government to be, and then have those rules, the guardrails to sort of keep us within that.
And I think this is a great discussion. We're down to into the weeds and the mechanics of it. I mean, I think that's appropriate. And I do agree with you that using potential GDP mitigates some of my concern about the cyclicality. But if you do a little bit of a calculation, it would have significantly constrained our ability to respond to the Great Recession. And that's the kind of thing that I worry about. And I won't go on, but I'll just say I think there's, in the same spirit, I think there's other approaches that I would take, or at least we could explore, that I think might mitigate some of these concerns and still address the issues that you have.
Right. Thank you. Vice Chairman Colby.